All right, welcome to the fourth and final part in my lecture on pre-Columbian civilizations, how they developed and how they fell. Last time I talked about how the Aztecs were conquered by the Spanish. This time I'm going to talk about how the Incas in South America met a very similar fate. And one of the instrumental figures in that fate would be Francisco Pizarro, another Spanish conquistador. And very similar to Hernan Cortez, he began by living in Spanish-occupied Caribbean and worked as a successful member of several expeditions into South America, including the European discovery of the Pacific Ocean. In 1523, Pizarro began a series of expeditions exploring Incan territory. Eventually, after persuading the Spanish royalty, Pizarro set off on an expedition into the Incan Empire proper in 1531. And Pizarro's expedition would consist of a single ship, 180 men, including several of Pizarro's brothers, actually, and 37 horses. And, this is a pretty tiny expedition. He would later be reinforced by an additional 2 ships, but, I'll explain later how such a tiny force was able to take down such a mighty empire. And when Pizarro arrived, a meeting between his party and the standing Incan ruler Atahualpa was arranged in the city of Cajamarca. And Pizarro immediately organized an ambush against Atahualpa. And this was actually inspired quite a bit by Cortez's tactic of, performing a coup on Moctezuma, the Aztec leader, and kind of beheading the empire in that way. So, this was a very similar tactic. When Atahualpa arrived, the Spanish descended and took Atahualpa as a hostage. And Atahualpa was forced to procure a room full of gold and silver in exchange for his freedom. Though, perhaps unsurprisingly, after Atahualpa managed to collect the precious metals from across the Incan Empire, the Spanish executed him anyway, under a supposed charge of conspiring to mount a counteroffensive against the Spanish. Though, that was complete bogus. There was no such thing. It didn't happen. But after Atahualpa's execution, the Spanish presented Tupuhualpa, which was another potential heir to the Incan throne, who had been living in hiding, as the new heir that the Spanish chose to, rise to the Incan throne. And so what this essentially did was they traded Atahualpa, who was, an unwilling prisoner, for Tupuhualpa, who had, been living in hiding. So, the Spanish bringing him out of hiding and bringing him into power kind of, indebted Tupuhualpa to the Spanish and allowed them to, manipulate him into allowing the Spanish to essentially turn the Incan Empire into a puppet state. After Atahualpa's death, however, the Incan forces around Cajamarca retreated, and Pizarro would march towards the capital of Cusco. There were several skirmishes with Atahualpa loyalist forces along the way, however, and the most troublesome event of the journey was the death of Tupuhualpa, their chosen heir. But this actually turned out to not be much of an issue because the Spanish immediately replaced him with his brother Manco Inca, under very similar terms as Tupuhualpa. And the Spanish were very successful from this point forward. Manco Inca was crowned, and the Incan Empire essentially became a Spanish puppet state in 1533. So, like I said, 180 men, some horses, a few boats. It's kind of wild that this tiny expedition was able to take down the Incan Empire with, very little fighting. And there are actually a whole bunch of factors that went into how this went down. And, some of the factors I mentioned for the Aztecs also applied, like, superior European technology, and also, but actually, European disease would actually be more of a factor in the conquering of the Inca, as I'll mention a bit later. When the Spanish Another additional factor is when the Spanish arrived, the Inca were actually embroiled in a civil war that had been going on for several years regarding the succession to the Incan throne. And this had actually started after the first outbreak of smallpox had killed around 200,000 Incas, including the current ruler along with his preferred heir. So there you go. The Spanish didn't even have to do any work. Their diseases took out the Incan ruler without them even being there. And in fact, when Pizarro arrived, Atahualpa had just won a 6-month campaign against his brother Huayna Capac for control over the empire. So Atahualpa had barely been in power, and the empire was still very unstable. And even when Atahualpa was in Spanish custody as basically a Spanish prisoner, he used his limited power as the Incan ruler he still had to have his brother and political rival Huascar, as well as Huascar's supporters, killed, to kind of eliminate competition, even though, the far more dangerous threat was the Spanish. This destabilization played a massive role in the Inca's downfall. And this power vacuum in this nexus of power, like chaos, high up in the Incan Empire, allowed the Spanish to easily find candidates for the Incan throne, that were desperate enough to seek help from the Spanish to achieve their station. Even if it meant relinquishing Incan independence to the Spanish. And this was the way the Incan Empire fell, and the way the Aztec Empire was conquered. They share a lot of similar DNA. And the fall of both of these American empires, they kind of share a common theme. So in both instances, the Spanish, leveraged local politics and power structures in order to gain control without the use of a full-scale Spanish invasion. This occurred when Cortez, like I mentioned, recruited native allies who resented the Aztecs in order to essentially pit the Native Americans against each other. And this kind of similar tactic repeated itself to maybe an even higher degree with Pizarro's, supporting an underdog vying for the Incan throne, in order to gain a more loyal ally. As well as eliminating the most potent Incan threat. The one who had actually the most power over the Incan forces. And both of these strategies worked to such great effect because Spain's influence was presented as simply another player in power dynamics that had been interacting for sometimes hundreds of years, particularly in the case of the Aztecs. And the scale of Spain's ambitions was kind of an alien concept to the natives' notion of conquest. And I won't get super deep into it, but I just want to talk a bit about the aftermath, what happened after the Spanish conquest. And essentially, the encomienda system, which had actually been used to subjugate Muslim and Jewish people in southern Spain, that had been, subjugated after southern Spain had been reclaimed under Spanish control. This system, the encomienda system that had been used originally on them, was repurposed onto the Native Americans. And this system was used to give Spanish encomienderos power over a specified number of natives, who would provide a tribute of precious metals. And, though this system was effective at first for extracting gold and silver from the Americas, the horrific decline in native population, combined with a shift towards agriculture, made it necessary to shift to a new system. And the hacienda system would largely replace the encomienda system, and, though it supposedly supported paid free labor, the workers essentially remained in a state of enslavement through various tactics, such as, keeping the higher-ups would keep the workers indebted and unable to break free. And actually, this system would remain in place in some areas up until the late 20th century. so it was very long-lived. And the Spanish government, did attempt to mitigate the humanitarian consequences of these systems, such as through the law of Burgos and the new law of the Indies. These completely useless. They had no effect. The Spanish Empire really had very limited influence on their colonies in the Americas in this way. And native populations would end up plummeting, mostly due to European diseases. All told, there were around 50 million natives before the Spanish arrived, and after, or by the 17th century, there were about 4 million left. And from the Spanish perspective, the Americas would become an immense source of precious metals for the Spain in the early years, and then they would become a vast source of income through agriculture a bit later, and this would generally serve to strengthen Spain's imperial ambitions. And that's where I'll leave it. So concludes my lecture on the ill-fated growth of pre-Columbian civilizations, how they developed and how they eventually met their fate. Thank you, and farewell.